Okay, this is going to be a bit of a departure from my normal videos just because, it's my channel. I can do what I want. Usually I try to watch at least one or two movies a week that I haven't already seen, and so often they don't always immediately grab me, or at least not in a way that I really care to create content about. And as I've discussed before, I don't have a strong desire to delve into more mainstream movies, so anything that's Oscar nominated is unlikely to be spoken about on this channel. And yes, even something like Well Rider, which I could easily repackage as Woke Rider or whatever it is that I do. But in regards to more mainstream movies, there's only so many angles, and as such, there's very limited potential to speak about something in a way that hasn't already been spoken about, and in a way more eloquent fashion. However, I also made it a personal goal to release more content this year, and so I feel compelled to do something. First things first, I'm not pretending that the US isn't stumbling face first into fascism. This channel is definitely propaganda. I use film and entertainment as a filter to project my own political leanings. I definitely haven't been subtle about it, but just in case some of you didn't already know that. This channel was always meant as a broader discussion, unencumbered by the whims of the present. However, our president here in the United States is not great, and there is a sense of immediacy and dread that I just can't personally shake, and I just want to get some of this off my chest. So I guess I'd like to start by saying the important thing is to organize, find a mutual aid group, join your local DSA chapter, or any party that is doing work with any actual infrastructure that can affect change and mobilize rapidly. And given I'm not particularly someone who fits neatly into any major political organizations, I can understand if you're from an area where perhaps the closest thing to progressive politics is your local DNC chapter. Trust me, I get it. If you're from a rural area or an exurb, choices can be limited. Like I've stated before, I'm an anarchist. I don't believe in unjust hierarchies. My ideal world involves voluntary, horizontal, democratic organization. However, that doesn't mean that there aren't instances when it's best or even necessary to defer to expertise or a more effective distribution of labor goods. Because of that situational flexibility, I do believe there's nothing wrong with caucusing with people, even if you only marginally agree with them. Because it's not going to be enough just to create community locally, but you're going to have to find wider networks you can collaborate with. While I don't believe you can fully trust liberals like those in the Democratic National Party, we often do share common cause. As a side note, I guess if you're not an American and you're hearing this, I mean liberal in a very American sense of the word. Obviously, liberalism is an all encompassing framework that both right and left leaning ideologies are capable of working within. For instance, if you're English speaking and not an American and you hear me say liberal or libertarian, those words likely mean something way different to you. This is because a lot of political discourse in the United States is poisoned by American capitalist propaganda. There are just a lot of words that have been given cultural connotations by the ruling class to mean things that are useful for their purposes, and not necessarily in line with how they are defined academically. And just off the top of my head, socialism, communism, anarchism, they all have very negative connotations in America, and those connotations do not really align with their actual textbook definitions. And even on the flip side, we tend to define capitalism in very glowing terms that only serve to deify the idea itself, and often you will find people who claim to like capitalism because of things that capitalism is not even responsible for, like employment or commerce. And huge spoiler, a lot of things you enjoy are not actually related to capitalism at all. Unless you're like a landlord or something, which if you are, please stop watching. I hate you. In fact, most of the things we enjoy that some may attribute to capitalism actually started as large-scale public projects that, once stabilized and made viable, were then handed over to private industry. See, that last part there, handing it over to private industry, that's the capitalism part. In fact, that's mostly what capitalism is. It doesn't do any of the other things its proponents say, other than it just privatizes the ownership of a public good or resource. But, in any case, liberals will always need people like us, and sometimes, I guess, we need them. Even if neither side wants to admit it, the numbers aren't really there without each other. It's an uneasy alliance, but that's how coalition building works. It's block by block. The 2024 presidential election should, without a doubt, be a wake-up call that anything outside of a Republican voting base is a patchwork of voting blocks, as opposed to the conservative cultural juggernaut longing to return to a pre-Civil War America. And, yeah, I know they too aren't a monolith, but they're at least focused. And I know there's this talking point about getting eligible non-voters activated, and sure, anything helps. I'm not great at sales and marketing. That's for someone else to tackle. And if someone can make that viable, then please do. That being said, Democrats don't like us and we don't like them, especially the ones that are willing to throw voters under the bus that are the most likely to support their party, like trans people, people of color, and those opposed to the genocide in Gaza. Well, genocide in general. All the people who are standing in the way of those voters being activated needs to be drummed out of the space, needs to be stripped of power or influence. If that means those people that are standing in the way flip and become like MAGA or something, it's unfortunate, sure, but human rights should never be negotiable. I just know it's going to be very rough, and I honestly can't say for how long. If you need to move and you can move, please do. Find a place you'll be safer and amongst more like-minded people. I know I'm just a disembodied voice to many of you out there, but as mentioned in a prior video, my parents are immigrants. There is a possibility that they can be deported even though they are naturalized citizens. There is a possibility that I could be deported if birthright citizenship is actually ended, because American conservatives have a very strong desire to dismantle the 14th Amendment so they can strip all non-white people of citizenship. But I'll save those anxieties for another video. Also, general advice, learn how to defend yourself, and I mean that in the broadest way as possible for you to interpret. Unfortunately, in the American and Canadian left, I know some things like gun ownership or learning martial arts is frowned upon, and frankly, it's baffling to me. After all, who does it serve when one end of the political spectrum has ceded any claim to the means of self-defense on philosophical grounds? I don't like to get too conspiratorial here, but buying into such propaganda is a victory for one side, and it's not the left. I'm definitely open to disagreement, but this is something that seems purely unique to a large portion of the left in the United States, and I can't help think it has something to do with the vestiges of the Reagan era that defined the parameters of what makes a quote-unquote real American. And then it was further shaped by the coastal liberal elites that prevailed after, and I believe their outright rejection of Reagan-era tropes caused this weird incoherence we currently live in. Because even today, there is a trope about the type of person who is suitable to access things like fitness and self-defense that I think is a little insidious. And I feel like it works effectively to dissuade progressive and left-leaning people from taking on those endeavors and creating those spaces. And I get it. We all want to believe we are somehow better than pop culture, but sadly, we just aren't. It informs a lot more about how we live our lives than a lot of us want to admit, from what we wear to what we say and how we say it. Because pop culture is an extension of culture itself, and I think a lot of people want them to exist in these finely demarcated parallel realities rather than the tangled mess that it actually does exist in. I mean, this is part of the reason I use movies to talk about the things that I want to actually talk about. That being said, if you so choose to enter a place like an MMA gym or a firing range, be mindful of the space you're operating in. I will say that most of the people you meet in those spaces are, for lack of a better word, normal, or in the very least, have unformed political beliefs, if they have any. And a lot of the time, they themselves are victims of cultural indoctrination, so they have this habit of what I would describe as just being reflexively reactionary. What I mean is this is not often out of any particularly sincerely held beliefs, rather it is because they've never been placed in a position to actually question why they believe what they've been told to believe. It's just a reflex. Don't get me wrong, there are definitely some vile people with terrible beliefs in those spaces. Just tread lightly, I guess. It's a mixed bag, and you kind of have to navigate it like it's high school. And even if you never have to use any of that sort of knowledge, and ideally you never will, it's always fun to learn a new skill, and it's exercise, which is, also good for you. And just to be clear, defending yourself doesn't always have to be a physical thing. I know I'm speaking from a point of privilege as an able-bodied person, but as I stated before, when I say defense, I mean a broad constellation of strategies designed to maintain your freedom and safety. Defense can mean a wide array of things. For instance, you still have rights. Learn them and exercise them while you can, when you can. We're not a completely totalitarian state yet, but I'm not going to lie, we're definitely headed in that direction. Okay, that's enough of that. I watched Dìdi recently, and it's a cute movie. I'm not particularly compelled to cover it like I normally would, largely because it's more character-driven than anything. For me, it's one of those emotionally evocative films like David Robert Mitchell's The Myth of the American Sleepover, Paul Thomas Anderson's The Master, or even Terrence Malick's Night of Cups. It just doesn't lend itself easily to description in terms of plot because the sequence of events are less about propelling a traditional narrative and more about using events to compose a detailed portrait of a character. Again, I have zero academic credentials in regard to film or media analysis. I know it's not a hard science, and I don't mean that in terms of difficulty, but I imagine that my unrefined amateur approach is likely to drive people who actually do have credentials in said field to get annoyed in the very least. And for that, I guess I'm sorry, but I like doing this. Chris Wang, aka Wang Wang, this kid, the main character in Sean Wang's 2024 film, Dìdi, he's a bit of a poser. I guess after making that claim, I should establish the parameters of what makes someone a quote unquote poser, at least in terms of skateboarding. Because it's actually not as easy to define as most people will think. Skateboarding is already a niche thing, and within it are even smaller micro niches and divisions, and even in those, there are specific trends, quirks, and skill sets unique to each micro niche. There truly are no rules to skateboarding. Well, I guess outside of having a skateboard. That isn't to say that there isn't a business side of it trying to define it so they can sell it. That isn't to say there aren't competitions where there's an attempt to quantify it for the sake of sport. However, there is no true skateboarding monoculture. In any pursuit, there are always going to be dominant trends. For instance, when an average person thinks of what skateboarding is, they think of either vert skating or street skating without any idea about the multitude of variations between and the plethora of different kinds of skateboards and the unique demands for the kinds of skating someone wants to do. So, given all the possibilities available, it's undeniable that there's just not one true way of being a skateboarder. As long as Chris owns a skateboard, he's in the club, right? Well, not exactly. Because owning a skateboard is easy, buying skate shoes is easy, obtaining all the material signifiers of what someone may associate with skateboarding is the easy part. The aesthetics of skateboarding can be bought, but the desire and the love of skateboarding cannot. And Chris does not love skateboarding. It's just not something he really even cares about. Rather, he seems more infatuated with the cultural associations tied to it, like the rebellion and danger. Even more troubling, Chris finds himself ingratiated to a few of the locally famous skateboarders by simply lying to them and saying he knows how to film skateboarding. He owns a camera. Sure, that's true. But much like his ownership of a skateboard doesn't make him any more of a skater, owning a camera doesn't make him any more of a filmer. And as an aside, I'll say the film's director and writer Sean Wang does seem to have an eye for skateboarding and how to film it. I'm not entirely certain Sean Wang has any experience with skateboarding or street skating culture, but he does at least put in the care to film the skateboarding in a way that would be appealing to an audience that does skate. And I guess for anyone that is curious, the three basic elements of successfully filming a skateboarding trick is as follows. Number one, obviously you want to see the skater. Number two, you want to see whatever obstacle that is being skated, preferably in full or framed in a way that the audience understands the scope of its dimensions. And finally, you want to see the skater actually land and roll away. I can't tell you how deeply frustrating it is to see half-popped, unlanded tricks on film. It's something that most people probably don't notice, but it is something that happens a lot across all forms of media that use video. And I guess if you're a non-skater watching this, which I imagine would be most of you, I hope you start noticing this too, and I just want it to drive you crazy like it does me. Anyway, in the larger context of the film itself, the skater boy arc that Chris Wang goes through is presented as merely a phase, a brief episode in a young boy's search for identity and social acceptance. It actually doesn't even take up that much of the movie's runtime. Chris is found to be a fraud pretty quickly, not only lying about his prowess as a videographer, but also getting caught in a lie about being half white for reasons the audience can only speculate upon. I will say, as a non-white person, and maybe even more specifically as an Asian person, I understand to some degree the desire to not accept yourself in a country that consistently tries to keep you a perpetual outsider and foreigner. And maybe identifying as half-white is just some weird coping mechanism to deal with his own internalized racism. But I can't really speak to that. I do have my own theories based on my own social interactions with noticeably mixed Asian people versus their white passing counterparts, versus Asian people who were adopted and raised by non-Asian parents, but it's not really worth airing out on YouTube. That's our business. I feel like I've said all I wanted to say about inter-Asian American affairs in my video on the motel, or as I labeled it, the woke-tel, because that's a thing I do for some reason. Okay, I know the reason. It's because I find it personally amusing. But this channel is meant as a beacon to find and connect with other weirdos like myself, and not necessarily meant to cater to a broad audience for whom I couldn't care about. Like I said a second ago, this subplot doesn't even last that long, so why am I even choosing to focus on Chris Wang's skater arc at all? Well, as I stated in the beginning of this video, the US is headed for a pretty dark time. It's no longer some far off hypothetical. It's not something you can really gesture towards anymore or pay lip service. We've reached a point in time where people really can't just wear the aesthetics of progressivism or leftism or whatever it is that is in opposition to this American techno-fascism we're almost certain to reside under soon. Resistance to fascism is not some t-shirt you can just buy. There is going to be a lot of pain, and I'm not even sure that's something that can be undone. At least not easily, and maybe not even in our lifetime. The reason I think this is because, well, a few things. The first being that no nation is forever. In the history of mankind, the map of the world has never been static. Even today, there are people that are growing up in a world with a South Sudan and an independent Kosovo. Countries that they will have no memory of never having had existed, and for whose silhouettes on a world map will never seem odd or out of place. The United States itself, as it exists today, is not even 100 years old. A lot of the world order as we know it isn't that old. And yet, if you grow up in America, there's this sense of permanence, this sort of finality and destiny, that the US was always what it was going to be since 1776, and that because of this, the United States is some exception to the general pitfalls of the human condition. Our mythology, as Americans, is one of an unbreakable resilience and enduring stability. But, after all, it is just a myth. Nations are not forever. I learned this from an early age because my parents are refugees. It wasn't something they would always discuss in depth because, well, why would they want to relive that? They definitely become more open as I've become an adult, but for the longest time I just knew that they were from somewhere and there was a war. I knew that the town that they were from no longer exists on the world map because, Henry Kissinger. Obviously, fuck that guy. I'm glad he's dead. I just wish it happened way, way, way sooner. In any case, my parents' hometown was eventually rebuilt, but when it was also renamed. So physically, there is a town where their hometown once was. It's just not the same one. In addition, throughout my lifetime, the world map has changed in so many ways. The USSR dissolved, Yugoslavia stopped existing, as well as Czechoslovakia. Yemen was once two separate countries. All of this is to say that particular bit of propaganda about the United States being exceptional in its endurance was never able to take hold on me as I was growing up here. Don't get me wrong, I am screwed up in other ways because I am American, but just not in that particular way. The second and more distressing reason I feel the United States has reached a point of no return is that the most prominent amongst us have ceded any semblance of resistance to creeping fascism by either choosing to ignore it or just outright embracing it. At a time when it's getting even more dangerous to just be anything other than a cis-white heterosexual male, the people who have the most power to actually push back, who have the platforms to galvanize and mobilize, are abdicating any and all responsibility, because the threat to their actual comfort is now real. The privileges of their class are and always have been far more important to them. Sure, it's fun and games to play resistance politics when there is nothing at stake. However, we live in a time when consequences are not just a few missed opportunities to be blessed by some oligarch's multinational billion-dollar company to sell ads. The threat to our actual safety and health are no longer the logical endpoints of some thought experiment. Fascism is staring us in the face, and I don't want to be a bummer, but you're going to find that most people are not willing to face it. What's happening is nothing new, it just hasn't happened to us before. For better or worse, we're going to find out who the real deal is and who are just being posers. It's going to be a painful reckoning, and unfortunately, if history is any indicator, we're going to find that resistance is a rare and precious thing that needs to be carefully fostered. I can't promise that things will be okay, but I can guarantee that they never will be if this rising tide of fascism isn't pushed back against. I know things can feel hopeless at the moment, but we're not powerless. We just have less power. For now.